My name's Helen.
Hi, I'm Smith. He's our Green Building Council.
So from where?
UK Green Building Council.
Oh, welcome. Thank you. Hi, Lucas. Hi. I don't know you.
No, I don't know you.
I'm Helen.
I'm Sam the School Officer from us, yes.
Okay, great. Thank you for joining. Yeah. This is. Yeah. Sorry, I need to quit. Right. Okay.
Like the verification of what they need.
Welcome this morning. My name is Helen Walter-Terranoni, and I work for Trane Technologies as the Director of Global Climate Policy. We're here to talk about disrupting climate trends through next generation leadership. And I'll be joined by some very disruptive guests here in a minute, and I'll introduce them when they come up. I just wanted to tell you a little bit about Trane Technologies. We are the largest provider of heating and cooling in the world. I learned that yesterday. If about over 60% of the food that's moved around the world is moved by a Thermo King container. So we are very concerned about our footprint and the footprint of our customers. 15% of emissions come from heating and cooling buildings globally. Food loss and waste account for another 10% of emissions. So we are trying to push along with others to tackle that 25% of emissions. Of course, that requires balancing society's needs for critical services such as vaccines and complex processing for food and for other products for society, with the need to decarbonize for the world. I don't know how much you all know about Trane Technologies, but we were the first in the industry to have a net zero target, as well as a 2030 target and long-term targets. They're validated by what was called the Carbon Disclosure Project, so CDP, and they're public. Also, I would note that we have a gigaton challenge in our company, so we have a goal of reducing emissions from our customers by 1 billion tons by 2030, and we're well on our way along that journey. People have asked me how we get this done. One of the things that we do is that we pay our leadership. Part of their compensation is based on reductions in greenhouse gases from our customers' equipment. So everyone is very much bought in, and we are working hard to advance policy. I'm working hard to advance policies that support that. I would add as well that 93.7% or so of our scope 1, 2, 3 emissions come from our customers' use of our equipment. So it's very important. Certainly we're thinking about energy efficiency as well as the refrigerant transition. We're looking at energy storage as well as shifting load to reduce the need for peak plants that are so emissive. And so we are seeking to lead by example. We challenge other companies to follow us. And with that, let me invite you all to come on up, my esteemed panel, to come on up here, and let's have a conversation about how we can disrupt and move things forward. So let me introduce you. Come on up, folks. It doesn't matter. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Thank you, Lisa. Yeah. So I'm going to introduce them as we go through this conversation. So Liazat Rabiosi is here representing the Montreal Protocol Executive Secretariat. We're very pleased to have her here with us today. Liazat, thank you for joining us. The Montreal Protocol is one of the most successful and disruptive treaties in the world. Could you tell us a little bit about that work and maybe how you engage with that work as well?
Thank you very much, Helen, and thank you for inviting the Ozone Secretariat to this event and seeing us as a disruptive mechanism. I'm very privileged. Montreal Protocol, I don't know if it needs some introduction for the audience, is a multilateral environmental treaty that concerns the protection of the ozone layer, and the ozone layer depletion happens from the use of refrigerants that Helen mentioned in her presentation, that's mainly used in this refrigeration, air conditioning, heat pump sector, but also in other about 200 subsectors of the economy. So it's quite widespread use, and it was signed, Montreal Protocol, under the Vienna Convention for the protection of the ozone layer, was signed in 1987. So last year we celebrated its 35th anniversary. But at the time of the signing of this treaty, it's really, as Helen indicated, was disruptive in a way, because it's one of the first treaties that included many principles of environmental legal law, currently also discussed here at COP, precautionary principle, because the science was not convincing at the time. Many industries, many stakeholders were not convinced about the depletion of the ozone layer and how it's happening. But the government and industry also agreed to take this precautionary principle. So it's better we do something about it rather than face the consequences later. Start and strengthen approach. We start with something, and then as we go, as we get more scientific evidence, as we become more capable technologically, then we can address these issues more effectively. So most of the reduction schedules that we follow by the parties for reduction in the use of consumption and production of these substances started with phase down, which means a certain percentage, but then usually it goes towards complete elimination, phase out again. So this process of adjustment, so it's a mechanism that was also quite innovative at the time. You have amendment, which needs to go through the legal process of ratification, but the adjustment is something that parties can agree together, and it's it doesn't require ratification process, and it becomes legal in 6 months for all the parties that have already signed the protocol. So it's in a way also has been quite innovative and is disruptive, if you like, from the policy perspective. And then this idea of the common but differentiated responsibilities, that we need to bring everybody on board. We have different schedules for different countries depending on the economic status. So we have for developed countries, developing countries, and most importantly, and it's very innovative and I think unique still for the Montreal Protocol, is that we have our own fund, which was established in 1991, 30 years ago, that by which parties agreed, developed countries said, okay, we understand, we accept our responsibility for the environmental damage that we've caused, because developing countries did not play really much role in that, but because it's now used throughout the economies, it's helping to developing countries' economies grow, we need to take this responsibility. So they set up a fund, multilateral fund, for the implementation of the Montreal Protocol. And the replenishment of this fund discussion about replenishment take place at the meeting of the parties of the Montreal Protocol, which is a global decision-making body like here at COP, but it's much smaller in scale, but it's still a global, universally ratified treaty, so we have all the countries involved. So at the last, for example, meeting of the parties, replenishment for the next 3 years agreed on $1 billion, which is quite historical. And that is because of, in addition to refrigerant phase down and phase out, because there are parallel processes going for different types of substances, we also started focusing more on energy efficiency. So what happens that as we progress from one type of substance to another, we help the industries in developing countries through technology transfer, technical assistance to change. And with each change, there is energy efficiency happen as a part of the process. So this time, parties decided that, okay, it's happened, so we need to help the countries in a more concerted way. So it's also, in a way, it's something disruptive, if you like, taking on, having this very well set up mechanism under the Montreal Protocol, helping 144 developing countries through these funds. To also tackle something that is, has such a big impact on climate.
Liazat, thank you so much. I was going to ask you a question, but you answered all of them.
Sorry.
I want to. I congratulate the Montreal Protocol community on the approval of that replenishment. That is amazing, and I think as well. You know, there were some other wonderful decisions that came out of the meetings of the parties a few weeks ago that I hope you'll tell us a little bit more about when we're having our discussion. Thank you. Ryan, you work on building codes with the International Code Council. So you have a part to play in enabling new technologies as well as kind of limiting old technologies in the decarbonization and the climate work as well as general sustainability. Could you tell us a little bit about what you do there at ICC?
Yeah, so really appreciate the opportunity to be here. So ICC at its core is really focused on addressing sustainability, resilience, affordability, and safety in the built environment. And we do that through primarily the development and implementation of model building codes and standards. So really bringing together the best practices from across the industry, from across other sort of regulatory bodies from around the world, to really package those in a way that really sets the sort of minimum requirements of what we expect from buildings. And that in and of itself is certainly a process. But, you know, you could have the greatest code in the world, but if you don't have the support tools and the infrastructure behind those, you're not going to get the results that, you know, you're really intending. And so, you know, we have a lot of resources as well that support capacity building, you know, whether that's education and training, looking at the products that are available, you know, are they fit for purpose? Are they meeting the needs of the society? And so I think one of the important things when we talk about sort of disruption, you know, codes and innovation may not always be sort of together in the same sentence. But, you know, they can be, you know, a real driver of innovation and progress. So, Helen, as you mentioned, you know, there are certainly opportunities to look at, you know, how do we continue to progress forward in, you know, bringing best practices into the code development process, so that, you know, codes are a dynamic process, that we're, you know, constantly learning from, you know, things that are happening in the world, new technologies, and really bringing those all together into a tool that designers and communities can use, you know, to affect buildings across, you know, their entire infrastructure. So some of the things that, you know, we particularly focus on is that continual update process. So, you know, our model codes are developed on a 3-year cycle, really going out to, you know, industry practitioners, manufacturers, designers, to really bring, you know, the best practices, the new technology into the code development process. But even with that 3-year cycle, you know, that may not be quick enough for some of the things that are out there, new technologies that are being developed. And so really enabling things like product evaluation process where, you know, we can identify, you know, what are the tests that, you know, sort of new materials or new products, you know, should go through. If they're not mentioned in the code, you know, how do we prove that they actually, you know, meet those requirements? And so, you know, having those sorts of mechanisms in place is really essential. You know, a couple other things that I'll mention sort of relative to, you know, codes. You know, they really support a broader ecosystem. So I mentioned, you know, some of the things around capacity building, product testing, product evaluation. But, you know, there's so many different things that need to sort of come into place to really make those effective. And so one of the things that we've been particularly working on is capacity building, you know, for the broader industry. So today's an exciting day with launch of the Buildings Breakthrough. one of the things that we've pulled together as a supporting initiative is really focused on assuring that codes are in place to address mitigation and adaptation needs consistent with the breakthrough, but also that there's investment in the folks that are using those codes. And so really moving forward on capacity building in that space. I guess the other thing, that I'll mention, in addition to sort of the traditional codes that folks think about, we're also active in the standards space. So codes sort of are a collection of standards on how do you actually do something. And so when we talk about decarbonization of buildings, for the past 50 years we've talked about the operational side of buildings, but sort of as we move forward closer to zero energy buildings, the embodied piece is becoming even more important. And so how do you sort of think about buildings holistically across their entire life cycle? And so working with ASHRAE, we're developing a standard on quantification of whole life greenhouse gas emissions. And so how do you sort of understand the broad impacts of buildings across their life cycle? How do you then make sort of decisions around benchmarking, material usage, measurement, targets, sort of all of that piece without having the sort of standards in place to underlie that consistent methodology? And then I guess the other sort of challenge I will put to folks in the room and folks that sort of work in this space, we really need industry and policymakers sort of driving towards the adoption and implementation of codes. So certainly participating in the code development process wherever you are, but then also advocating and engaging with policymakers, with others in the industry to assure that we're continuing to drive progress through codes. So really appreciate the opportunity to be here.
And by the way, it's no accident that I am introducing the two of you to each other because you need each other.
Absolutely.
Ryan, one of the things I'm going to ask you about when we're talking is around, and maybe you could talk a little bit now. It's a very interesting concept, the way that you all think about energy in buildings. You all use kind of energy performance rather than, you have some flexibility in the way that you look at energy. And maybe we can talk, if you want to talk now or if you want to talk about that a little bit more later. I think that that's interesting. And I think the other thing we're going to want to talk about, just to give you a heads up, we're going to want to talk about, there are some jurisdictions, some cities and states and counties that are using codes from 2012, 2009, how do we help people move that forward? How do we help that across the world? So you can answer that now, or we can have a conversation. We'll have a conversation as we go, okay?
Yeah,
all right, wonderful.
Sounds good.
Wonderful, okay. Isaiah, we're thrilled to have you here as well. And, I think we at Trane Technologies, so we do a lot of training. And I view entry into the world of becoming a technician as a gateway to a better life for families. Oftentimes, there's a lot of turnover in the technician world, not just in other countries, but also in the U.S. There's a lot of turnover in the technician world, and so people come in, get trained, get skilled up, and they go do something more interesting to them, maybe, or they go do the next thing, right? And although some technicians come in and they're there for decades because they're happy with what they're doing, so. So you're working on something around, you're working around kind of socializing this concept of green jobs, Isaiah. Could you tell us a little bit about your work?
Yeah, so I think for starters, I do a lot of environmental media communication work. So as you mentioned about setting up those parameters and those logistics, how do we communicate that to the general audience? And for realistically, everyone, collectively, most Americans believe in global warming or that there is something happening in extreme temperatures, but that's pretty much that they end their conversation there. So as an environmental media creator, I think one thing to really recognize is that the power of media and marketing, right? So traditionally, traditional media like journalism accounts for 44% of where people get their environmental issues, and then you have social media, which accounts for 25%, and then you have TVs and films, which is 22%, but yet they still lack a lot of knowledge and apprehension of like what it means to be in those industries. So as an environmental media creator, I built a large influencer platform with followers that are mainly Gen Z and millennials, and also parents who are really interested in learning more about the environmental issue. But a lot of young people to me are in college right now that are really interested in learning more about how to break into the environmental or green industry, because most jobs that people don't want to work at NGO. They want to work for a for-profit company that does pay them an average entry salary. So the idea of Sustainable Jobs is like an independent web series I created based on the origins of dirty jobs.
Yep.
If you all watched it from Mike Rowe, he would go to the America's most dirtiest jobs in America. And it was very this industrialized working class American job of like, this is the American way of life of building up your wealth. But the thing is that has shifted over our generations. Gen Z says 76% of them that apply for jobs want an environmental related career or a company that is applicable or working towards an environmental initiative, because that to me then means that they're socially impact. And so when it comes to like the HVAC or like the building space, I think one of the things that people don't recognize, and when I visited Trane Technologies back a few months ago, is everything it can be communicated if done right. And the thing is that many of these traditional companies that don't really use social media as much to really, promote their products, because it's usually with like these large institutions or corporations that they're dealing contracts with, it's important to understand the benefits that these corporations are doing in order to actually train the new workforce. Mm-hmm. So I think the point of the series on my end that I'm working on, hopefully I get to work with Trane Technologies next on the next episode, is to really inspire those people to understand that these green jobs have always been accessible to a lot of people. And I know that regardless of people's like political views around climate change, I do believe that everyone in the transition to a green economy should have access to green jobs, because a lot of people always fear that rhetoric of like they're taking our jobs away. Instead, you see these companies who are actually saying, no, we actually have like these goals and implemented, and we will train you and we will help you and we will make sure that you have a well-paying salary.
That's great, Isaiah. Thank you. We strive at Trane Technologies to have our workforce look like the communities where we operate, and we do deep STEM education, so science, technology, engineering, mathematics education from very young children all the way up. We have a lot of programs with veterans and women and folks that you wouldn't normally think of when you think about working in this space. And so, I think that kind of outreach kind of plays to that bigger audience. And go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to add, and I think that's where I think companies should start shifting their marketing and budget goals with not agencies that just produce a 2-minute commercial that's not going to be seen by young people, but instead hire people like us that reach thousands of audiences per month, and we say, we will bring those people to awareness. And not only that, when I pitched corporations to get these episodes funded, I said, you save half the money instead of working with an agency, and then it's good PR organically because you do get to show people like the benefits of that industry. And then 3, it's just the fact that those people are going to then trust that company because of me, and that builds that value trust in the long term.
And I will tell you this, I actually don't care. We just need folks to come into this space because it's growing, and we're just going to continue to need more employees. And we do a lot to elevate people and help them to reach their full potential in their careers. And it's a great opportunity, and it's a great place to work. Anyway, I will stop that, and we'll move along to Avipsa Mahapatra. Avipsa and I have known each other for quite a number of years, and somebody called me the other day a disruptor in policy, and the first person I thought of that is truly a disruptor in policy is Avipsa. And before you start, I want to congratulate you, because you just wrote an astounding body of work on racist use of mercury in whitening creams, skin whitening creams, and you saw that advance. So I do want to give you a minute to, even though that's not this, I do want to give you a minute to talk about that and brag a little. You can do it before or after. You say whatever you want to.
Thank you, Helen. This is a magic. I shouldn't say that. This is a magic microphone. It just turned on. Thank you, everyone, for having me. I'm Avipsa Mahapatra. I'm the Climate Campaign Director at Environmental Investigation Agency. And I think, as you can tell, our name itself is disruptive. We investigate crimes against nature, crimes against climate, and crimes against the environment, and use that primary evidence to disrupt policy. And that gives us an amazing platform to go to policymakers, to go to corporations, and say, this is greenwashing, or this is BS, and you need to change this. And in that, we do a lot of work in the cooling sector. When I was a youth climate activist, many years ago, I don't want to age myself, I did not think I would end up in the HVAC industry. That was not something I was wanting to do. I was a climate activist. Except that as soon as I looked at the Kyoto basket of gases, if you think about it, the fluorinated gases, the refrigeration sector is the only greenhouse gas in the Kyoto basket that is synthesized by human beings. And in a world where we are not at all on a path to 1.5 degrees Celsius, it is absolute insanity to create gases in a lab that are continuing to damage our climate. And it is further insanity simply because the same sector has had these oopsie moments for many decades, right? So we started with the CFCs, the ozone depleting substances, as Liazat spoke about. And we realized that, oops, our refrigerants are creating a hole in the ozone layer. Let's fix it. We took a long time. A lot of people died. But eventually, we got the successful Montreal Protocol Treaty to get to that goal. And then, since then, that was a real disruption in global environmental policy. Montreal Protocol still remains the most successful environmental treaty simply because of the things Liazat already mentioned. There is a technology transfer element, there's an actual financing mechanism, and there's the institutions and mechanisms, the technical committee, the economic assessment panel, the scientific assessment panel. But after creating all of that, if we look at the last 20 years, I would say that we've not really disrupted the policy making in the Montreal Protocol, but we've been making incremental changes where we are on this treadmill of one synthesized gas, one synthesized fluorochemical that damages the ozone, to another fluorochemical that damages the ozone a little bit but really damages the climate, then to another chemical that really damages the climate. I'm talking about HFCs. And our job now as a global community is to ensure that we're not repeating the same mistake and locking ourselves in to another suite of gases that then 10 years later we go, oops, that was a mistake. Let's spend a lot of money and a lot of time and fix that again. We don't have the space to make more climate and mistakes. So that's sort of my overarching point I would like to make. And then in terms of disruption, I would say that the reason, for example, why an EIA got into this space is back when we were doing the CFCs phase down globally, what we saw was on the US-Mexico border, canisters of CFCs were getting smuggled, and the street value of that was competing with cocaine. Mm-hmm. And that investigation got us into the DOJ and got us into the Montreal Protocol to really make sure that we are preventing illegal trade of these substances. Because a treaty is only as successful if it's actually implemented. So we often hear that the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol can get us 0.5 degrees Celsius of reduced warming. That is if it is actually implemented and enforced. And so in that direction, we have worked very much in terms of policy disruption in raising the profile of how much illegal trade can contribute to the non-enforcement of this treaty. And one successful example recently is that in the United States, after years of advocacy, we now have an all-of-government approach, which includes everybody from the White House to the CBP to the State Department. You name a department and they're probably in there, attention on illegal trade of these fluorochemicals. But I'll take a step back and say that if you think about sort of the life cycle of these chemicals, what's important is turn off the tap, mop up the mess, and ensure everything in between gets actually addressed. So I'll pause there on the refrigerant part, and thank you for introducing the other work I do just as a side hobby in the free time that we have. And that is not at all related to refrigeration, but I will just say 2 sentences about it since you asked. There is the Minamata Convention on Mercury, which is a global convention, a different one, that prohibits Minamata disease, if people don't know, was because of mercury pollution. And this convention is trying to decrease global mercury pollution. And growing up in India, and I'm sure a lot of people of color have seen this around the world, there were these creams advertised. Those were fairness creams. And you would see these ads where there's a sad little girl who's dark and does not have a husband or a career. And then she applies these whiteness creams, becomes whiter in 14 days. And then, woo, she's an air hostess and has a handsome husband. And obviously, there are many, many things wrong with that. But at the end of the day, the fairness cream industry itself is based on racism and colorism, and it is absolutely unacceptable that in 2023, women around the world are still applying creams which now we investigated and found have intentionally added mercury in those creams. So women are literally poisoning themselves, not just women, I would say, though majority women in our surveys, but people of color are poisoning themselves, and as a global community, we are complicit if we don't stop this. So that was the investigative report that Helen mentioned, and I'm pleased to inform that after doing that investigation, the Minamata Convention has now, just in this last COP, which is the Conference of Parties, come up with a decision to regulate the addition of mercury in these creams. I think I've spoken for way too long, so I will stop now and pass on the mic.
No, we're still friends because I could listen to you forever. So with that, we're going to talk more about what's needed next from the policy side of things. But first, Meg, I want to go back to you and hear a little bit about some of the other great decisions that the parties made this year in Nairobi. There were some really kind of interesting outcomes around dumping as well as around illegal trade. So could you share some of that with us, as well as the next report and reports and what is going to come there, that quadrennial report system?
Thank you very much. Yes, as you can see, that organizations like EIA keep us on our toes. So with their amazing work, and thank you, Avispa, for what you shared. Maybe just to respond to that, as an environmental sustainability practitioner, I very much agree with what Avispa is saying, but also looking from the perspective of an MEA and Ozone Secretariat, and what makes Montreal Protocol successful is this idea. Yes, it's incremental, but at the same time, it's science-based policy making. So as soon as the science is available, technological options are available, then it allows all the countries that are also developing countries that still want to develop and have their space on this planet to progress. That's why we have this slow transition from one type of substance to another. This idea of industrial rationalization is very much embedded also in the text of the Montreal Protocol, that allows to use certain exemptions and exceptions for gases that's perhaps, yes, they're ozone depleting, they're greenhouse gases, but essential for the economic activity and development of countries. Not, just in a way to explain a bit that. In terms of new decisions and where Montreal Protocol is going, yeah, we have quite amazing discussions. I'm personally very much excited, again, as environmental practitioner, not so much ozone secretariat perspective, but on the life cycle refrigerant management decision that asked us to, first of all, share information, what is possible to do, because under the Montreal Protocol, we control production, consumption of these substances. We don't really control as a legal measure the end of the life of these refrigerants, but as we know, and Helen is one of the experts on this issue of the ODS banks, so ozone depleting substances, and these gases are trapped for some time. In developing countries like AC would be used for 25 years, so using the same CFC, for example, or HCFC that has a high ozone depleting and global warming potential. So how to deal with this end of the life cycle. So I think this is quite an interesting development, how we start addressing not perhaps maybe later with also more stringent regulation around that. But at least currently there is this desire of the parties to look at this more in a focused way. So there is also funding window available now for developing the inventory of how much actually ODS banks we have still in the countries and how effectively we can deal with them. And that is also one interesting area of linking with the climate discussions, because these ODS and HFCs are strong, very potent greenhouse gases. They're sometimes 2,000 times even more potent than greenhouse gas in terms of their global, than carbon dioxide in terms of their global warming potential. So there is this interesting business model emerging now of distracting and using this for the carbon offsetting through the carbon trading mechanism under the Paris Agreement. You mentioned the issue of the anti-dumping. So the states from the African states, they submitted a few years back a proposal to look at the issue of dumping inefficient air conditioning refrigeration equipment in their countries that still rely on these obsolete substances and energy inefficient. And they brought forward this idea of the shared responsibility. It's not just our responsibility of developing countries to put enforcement mechanisms, prevent these imports, but also exporting countries that, as we discussed with codes and minimum energy performance standards, as they progress, countries, manufacturing industries, they start producing more efficient technologies, but what happened to the ones that left behind? So often it's just exported to developing countries. Yeah, and I think these are some of the interesting directions that the Montreal Protocol is taking.
Thank you, Liazat. Avipsa, did you want to comment on something?
Yes. I think one of the key things that Liazat mentioned here, which is the life cycle refrigerant management part, we as EIA did a report and found that that is a climate opportunity that is 90 billion tons. So it is not insignificant in any way. We are talking about a huge climate opportunity, and it is indeed incredible that we now are looking at action plans on how do we get some of the climate mitigation tons that were left on the table for all these years. Because once you create these refrigerants, fine, you can reduce the production, but what happens to all of the refrigerant that's out there? And this concept deals with that. And I think I will agree with Eliasa that is definitely one of the areas that is very ripe for disruption, both in terms of reclaiming, recycling, as well as destruction, and doing that in an energy efficient and climate friendly way.
No, that's great. And I need to think of a better word for this, but I feel like recovery of refrigerants has been a little bit of an orphan in the policy world, and I need to think of a better word because that seems a little disrespectful. But it's kind of been on the sidelines, and we haven't really. I don't know of anybody in the world that's really figured this out. And
we call it the unfinished business of the Montreal Protocol.
I like that better. It's unfinished, but I think that. There are a couple of spaces that I think have not really. I mean, there were big things to do, right? I'm not saying that people made a mistake. I think that there are really big things to do, and this is the next, one of the next things to do. So, I'm excited. This just shows what a nerd I am, but I'm so excited for this report and to try to work on, thinking through information around this. So, Liazat, thank you very much. Ryan, I said that I'd circle back to you. You've met Liazat. You need to be best friends because we need to advance safety standards and building codes around the world. And as I think about, there are places that maybe don't even have them yet, right? We need that education, and we need folks we need to make sure that people understand, how to do things safely and how to and actually how to install equipment in a way that you maximize the energy efficiency of the equipment. Because if you don't do that correctly, you'll end up with refrigerant leaks and you'll end up with poor efficiency. And so, how do you all think about, kind of socializing and moving forward around the world? No pressure.
Yeah. So I mean, I guess I'll start with sort of how do we think about codes in general. So we produce 15 model codes that are coordinated. So really looking at the efficiency side of the equation through the International Energy Conservation Code, through the sort of safety and installation side through the mechanical code. But we also look at hazard resilience through things like the building code, wildland-urban interface code, and really seeing sort of buildings as a system. So really being able to sort of recognize, I think, you mentioned the refrigerant issue, the efficiency side, the sort of installation side, and the safety side. Sort of being able to look at that, comprehensively is really critical. So when we think about and engage sort of internationally, and even in the U.S., as you mentioned, we have states that don't have codes. We have states that are on 2009 editions of the codes. We have states that are on the 2021 edition of the codes, and then we have states that are even beyond sort of what the model codes are, which really provides a good opportunity to sort of see what works and to continue to progress. But how do we move forward from earlier editions of the codes, but then also engaging in communities that don't have codes at all. And so we've taken sort of the tact of really understanding the broad impacts that codes have. So if we talk about the energy efficiency space, sometimes energy costs resonates with folks, sometimes reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. Energy cost is certainly a huge one. But we can also talk about the resilience benefits of adoption of energy codes. So the U.S. Department of Energy actually just completed a study looking at the impacts that energy codes have on passive survivability. So if we think about sort of extreme heat or extreme cold events, having an energy code in place during those events actually allows people to stay in their homes comfortably longer, less health impacts, less deaths, less pressure on shelters, sort of all of those pieces. And then if we even take a step higher, less impact on the grid. So if we think about the role of efficiency in the resilience of the grid, less need for emergency generation, less peak demand, sort of all of those pieces. And so being able to sort of speak comprehensively about the role of codes, sort of no matter what your priority is, within your community, within your country, there are real opportunities there to move forward. And then, sort of, as I mentioned before, having a code in place is great. It'll get you something, but having that capacity surrounding it is really essential. So, education and training of code officials, of tradespeople, of designers, manufacturers, sort of all of that working as an ecosystem is really sort of what's important to drive progress.
So I'm going to tell a little story about my house. We built a room on my house for my mom to live with me, and we couldn't get the room warm. We couldn't get the room warm. It was wintertime, and after investigating all sorts of stuff, we finally figured out that they had failed to insulate above the room. So it's a little bit of an oops, right? But I think I saw a doubling of my energy bill. And so when I think about the literally thousands of dollars that and the greenhouse gases that we emitted, but the thousands of dollars that went back in my pocket because we didn't have to spend that on energy. And I think about people with a smaller budget than mine, right? And how important it is to have that building envelope in place in a way and designed in a way, insulation and other things that reduce the load and reduce those costs for families. That's real money. That's real savings for people. And I think that's a really excellent point. Right? Yeah. I don't know if you have anything else to add to that. Yeah.
I mean, I guess one thing I'd add is, well, maybe two things. Some struggles that we're having to address existing buildings. I think that's a huge challenge. Codes play a piece of that, but often need some sort of triggering mechanism to have those codes be effective. The other piece I'll add, and you sort of alluded to this, is some of the sort of first cost versus total cost of ownership or rental arguments that are happening sort of in the policy space. There are certainly segments of the industry that focus solely on sort of first cost as the driver. But if we think about sort of affordability or sort of long-term climate impacts, really having that sort of broader perspective of let's get people in housing, but let's actually make them able to afford the operation of that housing and keep that affordable housing. So lots of exciting things happening in the space.
Vipsa, did you want to follow up?
Yeah, I think I can say a few things that probably are difficult for Ryan to say, but I really appreciate how humble he is being, because it's often missed just how important this codes and standards world is to realize any of our ambition around implementing Kigali Amendment or decarbonizing cooling. Whenever I talk about codes and standards, I can see people getting walking back away from me, but really that is the lock that we need to unlock to allow for these new generation, new technology to really be implemented in a safe manner. That said, I would share that when I first started work in this area, I was shocked to hear, and maybe not a lot of people know this, that the safety standards and codes that govern a lot of our cooling technology are set by independent safety standards organizations or independent groups within those organizations that usually do not have government members or outside oversight. So in certain cases, certain codes and standards might be really obsolete, and they act as barriers in many ways to new technology. And so a lot of the work, which you alluded to this in your earlier comment, is there's definitely work to be done by advocates and by governments in ensuring that we are supporting and triggering this change to get to the climate benefits that we need to. And I will say share a very small story. Growing up in India, we had hydrocarbon refrigerators. The domestic refrigerator in our house, it has isobutane, which has a GWP of 4, which is the global warming potential of 4. And when I came to the US in 2012, none of the refrigerators in the market all of them were using HFCs, which were 3 to 4 digits in terms of their global warming potential. So every unit of refrigerant in the United States was several hundreds to 1,000 times as bad for the climate as every unit of refrigerant that I had in India, or most of the rest of the world. And the problem was old, antiquated, obsolete, fossilized, I can go on, safety standards and codes in the United States. And it took us a lot of industry sort of advocacy, where we heard from the industry saying, oh, Americans just need bigger fridges. That's why it doesn't work. Indians use smaller fridges. And okay, what about Europe? Oh, oops, we have the same size fridges in Europe and US. Interesting. So after that, we published a report saying bringing the American refrigerator industry into the 21st century. Because seriously, back in the 90s, if we could get to GWP4, there's just no excuse. And now, if you go to any Lowe's or Home Depot or anywhere you buy a fridge, 99% of the fridges are using refrigerants that are GWP4 or lower. But, so that just shows you the importance of how, how you need sometimes that advocacy element and the government sort of involvement in the safety standards and codes world.
Isaiah, I want to circle back to you. We're trying to, I don't think this is a problem limited to the U.S. I know it's not, because we see this technician problem around the world. we need just in our space, we need designers, engineers, technicians, folks that understand safety standards and building codes. Like there's so much work to do in our space. So if you could just help us with hiring all those people. No, but how do you think about like kind of growing and engaging the workforce and leadership in the future? Like how do we do that, and how do you think about that around the world? Like, are you going to go global after this? I'm just asking Isaiah if you.
Yeah, I mean, I think like it's really interesting because, fun fact, I think everyone knows now, like the U.S. White House government works a lot with influencers. Like, I mean, I've been invited to them at Kamala Biden, and I think I've been working with the DOE actually, for example, where I have, again, I come from an environmental science background, worked at TerraCycle, did not have like an environmental engineering background or energy background. But it was really interesting to see like the DOE has been a very large proponent of like, pushing for green careers or like these types of like getting the American industrialized economy out to a green new economy, especially Jennifer Granholm. She's like very like stronghold on it. I think that because the U.S. has become such like a very much like, it's very slow. It's behind. Like we are behind. Like the United States is really behind a lot of things, and it's like now like, oh wait, we can actually try to do something about it. I think the importance of being able to work with them and understand like what are their key goals and like what are my key goals is that they eventually want to scale these into programs. So like the Climate Civilian Corps programs in the White House, like I know that they're in development of that and like what it's going to entail, but I do think that a large percentage of that is actually training the Americans and then translating that experience internationally. I would hope that in other international countries that are already doing these types of solutions actually come and teach Americans more, because I think we are really behind in the ways that we think, and I think that's only because of like the policies and practices that really prevent us from moving forward, and the limitations where, if you put a policy, this corporation's not going to like it and they're going to lobby it against it and they're going to be like, no. So I do think that it is important that as a media creator myself, like communicating these types of jobs, I would hope that a lot of people get inspired by it. And so when I did a sustainable job series, like one of the episodes is already out, I remember getting a lot of comments on YouTube from different people from different countries, and then they were saying, I wish I can get trained at these jobs too. But I don't think that those jobs don't exist in those countries. They do. It's just that they're not well communicated again. So I don't think it's much about reaching them internationally, more like collaborating with different institutions, because I'm not the one with the funds. The corporations are. I'm not the one with the political advocacy. It's the NGOs and the governmental agencies. I'm just merely the communicator that helps make this accessible to the general population, so then we don't see misinformation on the rise where, like there's certain, educational or disinformation out there that says like if we use wind and solar, we kill birds and it's bad for the environment. So then, people are like, oh, don't do that. Or, I don't know, just a lot of things that I've seen online from the communication crisis standpoint when trying to translate these jobs is, from what I've seen with centrist and conservative groups, is that you can't just approach them and try to paint a picture green for them when they've already been disinvested, displaced, and threatened by their jobs. So ensuring that they're union jobs, ensuring that it's the same language as them, ensuring that the same people who work in those industries also come with them, so then they feel a sense of familiarity. So I do think that if we follow those models, we can achieve some success in the next few years. But of course, that is also dependent on our administration.
So, Liazad, I'm going to come back to you around workforce as well. So as I look at the Montreal Protocol family, I see things like the ACES Center in Rwanda. I see, a focus in the multilateral fund around training. And I've heard a lot of conversations around training and advancing that. Could you share a little bit about your perspective around, how we engage people and how we sometimes I hear the term skill up, help people to kind of grow their skills and learn about, this kind of work. And then maybe you could talk, I don't know if you are aware of the app that, folks have been working on. I can share a little bit about that if you are not aware of that. But I'd like to hear a little bit about you.
Yeah, maybe just to share experience how a treaty like Montreal Protocol is implemented at a national level. So before joining the Secretariat, I was actually with Ozone Action of UNEP and implementing the Montreal Protocol in 13 South Asia countries. So of course we have these policy regulations, but to implement it, you need to do so much effort in terms of capacity building, coordination, communication. So for example, the national focal points of Montreal Protocol at countries, I have to now work with the building sector to make sure that the building sector codes actually that are often too stringent to allow these natural refrigerants, like what Avispa mentioned, because this is the alternative that we are the industry tries to go for, but they're flammable. And so with this idea of convincing that it's actually they're flammable, but they're safe to use because of the charge size, and they could be safely used in air conditioner in a room, for example. So they have to communicate all these issues. They have to work also with technical, vocational, educational centers now for TVET, because we need servicing sector that is technicians that often in many countries like India is an informal sector. It's a very seasonal job. They just come, do it during the hot season and don't go away. So we need to discuss this also with these ministries of labor, not only Ministry of Environment, Ministry of Labor, because it's the one that deals with the technicians, this tertiary education, I think it's called, vocational education. And then you have to also work with Ministry of Education, of course. So it's a very multifaceted implementation process just for one treaty like Montreal Protocol. You mentioned the idea of the illegal trade, and they have to work with customs because it's very much a trade control. Most of these refrigerants are only manufactured in few countries, and they're traded, actually exported and imported. So they have to work a lot with the customs. So this idea of the coordination and integrated approaches towards implementing a specific policy objective, that's I think something that brings us together in this panel, and also links to this idea of skills and labor that needs to be ready to go with these disruptions, and it's unfortunately also a specific work stream that requires a lot of effort.
And I think you certainly hit a really important point that, sort of in the buildings industry, there are a ton of diverse opportunities, whether that's at the trade level, the policy level, the design level, there are lots of entry points, and we need folks in, sort of all of those. And I think there's a huge impact. There's huge opportunity to make an impact. We use buildings every day, even if people sort of don't think about it. How we use buildings has a huge impact on people's lives. So no matter sort of what your particular interest area or bent is, there are real opportunities to bring folks, into the industry, whether that's sustainability, resilience, social justice, technology. There's huge opportunities to bring folks into the industry and have them find sort of what inspires them. So join the buildings industry. Yeah. We're great.
Yeah, there you go, Isaiah. There you go.
I'm going in.
And feel free to jump back in anytime you want to. Okay. So I think I was trying to not turn this into a Trane Technologies advertisement, but I am going to say this. So my colleagues are very accomplished and innovative, and we have really cool new equipment designed. I'm just going to give an example. But this is just one of those examples that there are so many moving parts that have to fall into place from the workforce, from the building codes, from policy to kind of. It's not always a question of an invention because we've already invented it. It's a question of how do we get it adopted and advance it. So one of the coolest things that I saw when I went to our headquarters for the first time as an employee, there's these big tanks outside that are just huge, and they're full of ice. Down in the southern part of the United States, it gets hot. So at night when there's not as much demand on the grid, we make ice. and then during the day we use that ice to cool our facilities. So that's really interesting. But here's one that's even more complicated, right? So advancing thermal energy storage, through the building codes, like that's quite a process. Like helping people to understand that in the workforce, that's quite a process. But even more cool than that is the hot stuff on that. We use ice to heat. So if you stay with me. If it gets very, very cold someplace, like the temperature drops down to like maybe -5 degrees at night, that's cold enough to make ice, right? That's cold enough to make ice. And then during the day, when you want to heat, or if you want to heat at night, that ice is this temperature. It's not way down here. It's this temperature, and this is the temperature, 0 degrees C or 32 F is where we need to melt it. So when it's time to heat up the house for grandma, we only have to go from here to here to heat it. We don't have to go from -5 to come up. We can come from here up. So, but these are kind of cool and hot technologies. It's like, but those kind of innovative technologies are, they can't be implemented if they're not enabled in the building codes, if people don't know how to install them or maintain them, if there are not policies, that maybe make people think about those. And I would posit that 95%, 99%, we can get to those 2030 goals with technologies that exist. It's a question of uptake, and and I think that that these are the kind of things that need to happen to make that happen. Vipsa, you look like you're ready to jump in. Ryan's ready to jump in. You go.
I think one thing we haven't talked about yet, and I think having Isaiah there is very useful in that conversation, is that what you mentioned, the demand side. And I think Gen Z probably is, okay, let me take a step back. It doesn't, not just Gen Z, but all of us often think that, if let's say we are going to a supermarket, we all take our tote bag and then we bike to the supermarket, right? And we are like so environmental friendly. We're wearing everything organic, and then we're picking everything organic, except we open the refrigerator and whoosh, we've undone all of the climate benefits that we thought we achieved in that space. And so it's really important for consumers and customers to demand from our grocery stores, from our Starbucks, from our McDonald's, and so on. I'm just naming a few companies, not sure if they're customers, sorry if they are. But, so it's really important for us to demand as a community that, this is no bueno. Right, exactly. And I think so you're exactly right. So there's the policy aspect, but there's definitely a demand side education that also needs to happen. And I think that's a conversation that's very, Yeah,
and I just want to add, from what you were saying, because I worked with the EIA actually a few months ago doing the HFCs at your grocery stores. Moms on Instagram are the most sweetest people to me that actually really listen to what I'm saying, and they're the ones who when I posted that video were like, oh my god, I did not know this. Now I need to, how do I know where these HFCs exist? How can I get involved? And I feel like that's where parents, even though they're not experts in these policy things, can get really involved in these things for their health, their children's health, their friends' health. And I do think when I did that video using the footage that you all provided, it was a really eye-opening experience to me of I would have thought I remember sticking my head as a young kid in there, and just because I wanted to cool down, and not knowing that I was getting infected with all these chemicals, and just thinking, oh, everything's cool and clean here. But that helps push the needle forward.
Yeah, I think you've all hit on a couple important points. I mean, Helen, to your point, we don't have a technology problem in the building industry. I mean, we know how to do stuff. It's the policy, it's the implementation that really needs to drive us forward. Which then sort of brings, to the second point of, there have been some surveys done on just sort of regular citizens on understanding sort of building codes, what's adopted within their community. And most folks think, even if their community has, a 20-year-old code, oh, I'm fine. My, sort of local politicians have me covered. My home builder has me covered. I'm safe. We're up to the latest. And that's just not true. And so I think it's really an awareness problem of, if people knew that, or if people are buying a new car that was built to standards from 2006, I think they'd have a problem. Yet their homes are being built to standards from 2006. And so being aware of
I
that,
love that analogy.
being aware of that, should really drive folks to say, why? Why is my community accepting that? And so, I think that's a real sort of awareness issue that we have, certainly a challenge with.
Yes, now we're discussing the issue of energy efficiency of these rack technologies, equipment, but actually it's not just about the energy efficiency of technology itself. It actually comes with the ecosystem and this very much integrated need for integrated approaches, because it's, as we discussed, it's about buildings. These technologies are used in buildings. So if the building is not properly designed, then the demand for these technologies will keep growing, which is, in a way, is counterproductive. And then it's the idea of the lifestyles as well, how we use these technologies. Actually, by setting the thermostat a bit higher at 25 degrees instead of 18. I used to live in Bangkok. People love putting the ACs at 18. They like this cooling effect, but at 25 you're actually perfectly comfortable and productive. And the policies like in Japan, where they put these limits not to decrease the thermostat below 25, for example, during the day. So this all comes as then the need for an integrated approach. So just technology itself is not sufficient to make these systems more efficient.
We were talking about, we're running out of time. How did this happen? We were talking about the other day with some other folks around energy efficiency, and I wasn't going to bring this up, but this whole refrigerator discussion. There are some really basic things that people can do to maintain the energy efficiency of the equipment in their home, changing filters. Kind of cleaning out the coils around the refrigerator. Like there's some very basic things. Now I just can't even jump into this, but
setting the temperatures and stuff.
Yeah, setting the temperatures. There's some very basic things, and I think that's something. It's. The filter change isn't free, but a lot of this stuff is free to do. And so, Vipsa, you look like you're ready to jump in.
I would just say that is great, and of course we should do that. But as an environmental activist, I get a little defensive these days after decades of this corporate But I'm
just saying, don't not do that.
Yeah, absolutely. But at the end of the day, the biggest mitigation is still at the policy level and the corporate level, and our biggest, agency of change that we have as individuals is still our vote, our dollars, increasingly our clicks. But that's really it, and do the right stuff.
I'll get back on track.
But hold your supermarket accountable, and hold your local government accountable, and hold your country accountable to ratify Kigali.
Okay, let's get back on track. Let's disrupt. Let's not just clean our refrigerators. Okay, let me ask you. We probably only have time for maybe one or two more questions. So let me ask you about what are there innovations that you're seeing? I'm going to ask you this first. Are there innovative technologies that you're seeing that we need to be thinking about? How to advance those? How to advance uptake? How to advance codes that we need to be thinking about?
Yeah, I think going back to sort of using an analogy that Ryan has used, if you look at the basic working of a refrigerator or an air conditioner today, we're still using the same technology like from the early 1900s. We're still piping refrigerant through a cycle. And I think that the technology that excites me the most is this idea that you don't have to pipe refrigerant necessarily into a system to cool. So the idea of, and then you could also make it off-grid, which then, could maybe decouple you from how dirty or clean your grid is. So to me, if I was to think of like an ideal world situation, we will have a clean grid that feeds clean cooling, really clean cooling, which has zero impact on our ozone or our climate.
Okay, we will get on that. But to that point, I don't think we can talk about really 1.5 degrees without thinking about reducing loads and passive cooling. When we were in Nairobi just a few weeks ago, Liazat, I was so impressed by the building design. There are these open airways. I mean, I recognize it's 5,000 feet above sea level, right? It's not like other places in sub-Saharan Africa where there are bigger challenges, but it was so well designed. I'm seeing, around here there's curtaining happening where here at the Expo Center where, to kind of shade people, coatings on roofs. This is not going to make Trane Technologies any money, but it's kind of the right thing to do. And as we think about like heat islands in cities, like I think Avipsa, to your point, like there are old-timey things we need to think about, and then there are new technologies that we need to advance around that space. I don't know if anybody wants to jump in on passive cooling, but it's my new favorite hobby.
Yeah, it's also my new, not new, but his favorite topic about cooling, the need for cooling, that the buildings, of course, need to be properly designed to reduce this cooling load, but also buildings are very much affected where they stand, right? So this idea of the urban design, space design to provide more passive cooling. I love this blue zone with these curtains that provide so much respite from the quite hot, hot during the day. So yesterday there was a cooling pledge signed, was launched by the COP presidency, and the idea of this cooling pledge that we have Montreal Protocol, Kigali Amendment that focuses on technologies, on improving the incumbent technologies such as refrigeration, air conditioning, making them more efficient, but then we need much more beyond that. So cooling is also about this passive cooling solutions, buildings, but also access to cooling to the vulnerable communities that are most hit now by climate. So that's, I wanted to add that.
Brian, you look like you're going to jump in.
Well, so I'll give you my innovation. If you think sort of the refrigeration process at 100 years old is antiquated, we're still constructing the buildings the same way we've done for 200 years or more. And so I think there's real opportunity in the use of offsite construction. So thinking about how do we use manufacturing type processes to bring more buildings to the market. Higher quality, less environmental impact, less waste, increased job site safety, sort of all of those pieces to really address a lot of the challenges that we're facing. So I think that's sort of the biggest push for me is how do we take advantage of new processes that frankly aren't terribly new, but the industry hasn't really picked up yet.
My husband claims that my father-in-law invented that.
Okay.
But I bet a lot of other people also invented that. So, no, that's so interesting that you would say that. No, that's great. And I think I think one of the things that you talked about, Ryan, what I didn't want to miss, and I don't want to leave here without talking about credibility because Avipsa won't let me. On the standards side of things, Ryan, you talked originally in your opening remarks about basically measuring the efficiency of the components that go into a building through standards and looking at the overall performance of buildings. Could you talk a little bit more about the credibility for these codes?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, if we think about sort of buildings as an ecosystem, we start at, ideally the community level, but let's just sort of focus on the buildings level. You have sort of the entire impact, of the building as a whole, which is essentially, a collection of parts. And so, sort of being able to talk and compare sort of building to building, you need a mechanism to be able to standardize the collection of that data, have confidence that, sort of what that data outputs is actually correct. And if we think about sort of influence beyond the buildings industry, so investors, governments, sort of all of those pieces, they need a standardized basis to really help make decisions. So, the standard that we're developing with ASHRAE really provides that whole building perspective. But you also need the data and information on different choices of materials, equipment types, how that equipment is manufactured, but also how is it used. And so then you get to really understanding, sort of what goes into, creating that thing. And so environmental product declarations are really that mechanism to be able to, have, this product versus this product, what impact does that have? And again, that comes down to sort of trusting the data that comes in. So one of the things that we do, we're an EPD program operator. So we're accredited to ISO standards to be able to verify that process. And so being able to have sort of that comparability, that trust is really essential to then again sort of roll up into that entire sort of building impact. So we have a mechanism to be able to measure, but then we also have a mechanism to be able to benchmark and set targets, because that's really what we need to drive progress. So it's all sort of standards based, but then sort of having those standards again in and of itself is not going to get us there. We need governments, we need industry to start working towards implementation of those standards.
That's really great. And Isaiah, you talked a little bit about credibility. You have some street cred with folks, and I think that credibility helps gain interest in the topics. I mean, can you speak a little bit about how you have thought about how your reputation kind of helps to advance things a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the biggest struggles with a lot of industries is being accused of greenwashing or green hushing. And I think it is true that, all corporations, I've always said this theory of change is like, they do have an environmental impact. They have produced negative waste, and that needs to be addressed. I don't think that when corporations are really trying to communicate these new technologies, the new solutions being implemented, I think the way that they go about it is that the dangers is that they make that newest solution the whole picture of the brand or the whole company, and I say that's where it should be nuanced, where I think there should be like more clarity of like this exists and also this exists as another issue. So I do think building credibility with me, it's like with the brands I've worked with to produce these series, it's all about authentic storytelling. So really talking from the individual human level of what their story was to get into that industry, and then also going into like the challenges that exist in that industry of like they're not perfect because they're working in a level where the policies really prevent them from moving forward. So this is the best that they can do. But obviously, too, they can't go. Sometimes employees can't be too political because of certain corporate laws. But in private, we've talked about it, and they're like, the reason why we want that is that we want then the consumers to then demand us. And then that will demand the investor shareholders to start looking into new solutions.
Thank you, Isaiah. Liazat, the Montreal Protocol has been successful. It is ambitious, and people have done what they have committed to do. There's a reporting system. There's a lot of checks and balances to that system. So, from a credibility perspective, I see that through that process that. We can believe that the results are here. Can you talk a little bit about how that has worked?
Yeah, the Montreal Protocol is a legally binding agreement, so under it, parties need to report the data on about annual consumption and production of these substances. But then, as you mentioned, we have this oversight through the scientific panels, independent panels, might I note, that do this atmospheric monitoring. And if you remember the case of unexpected emissions of CFCs that were supposed to be banned and phased out in 2000, actually was they noted the emissions in the atmosphere of these substances. So it's, I think that altogether this bottom-up and top-down approach allows to progress and ensure the credibility of these global processes. So basically to say, yeah, we need everything. We need science, we need stakeholders on the ground, and the processes that, like meeting of the parties that allow all the countries to come together and discuss these issues. And that was also one of the success that Montreal Protocol community managed to recoup very fast and take very swift action against these unexpected emissions.
Vipsa?
I think they might kick us out of this room now. I feel everyone has made the points that we need to. The only thing I would say is that, everyone claims to be green, and there is greenwashing for sure, and the bigger picture story is that it's not going to fly. At some point, that's just not going to work. So I'll just end with that for now, and then I know they want us to be out, so we'll...
I want to thank you all for joining me today. We started strong on disruption. We've talked about enabling the transition. We've talked about credibility, and all of those things are such important elements to advance toward 1.5 only. So thank you so much for being here today, and I hope that you have made some new best friends, and that we can all work together to move things forward. Go ahead, Lisa.
Just to say that, as you Helen knows, we have a pavilion downstairs with some very sustainable ice cream. Please pass by.
Thank you, everyone.